The easiest way to measure a person's character is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. That was the last thought that crossed my mind before Trevor Collins lifted his crystal wine glass, flashed the kind of smile that only existed for expensive cameras, and turned an entire ballroom against me. The ballroom overlooked the Manhattan skyline, where walls of glass reflected 1,000 city lights beneath a velvet black sky. Every chair was draped in white linen. Every table shimmered beneath fresh orchids flown in from overseas. Waiters moved with practiced precision, carrying plates worth more than some families spent on groceries in a week. The invitation had described it as a $10 million investment dinner, a gathering reserved for executives, investors, founders, and people whose names regularly appeared in business magazines. I was only there because my wife, Danielle Brooks, had insisted I come. She had spent months preparing for this night, working late, sacrificing weekends, believing this event might finally earn her the promotion she deserved. I wanted to support her, nothing more. I wore the only tailored suit I owned. It fit well enough, though it lacked the recognizable logo stitched inside collars that seemed to matter so much to everyone else in the room. Danielle looked breathtaking in a deep emerald evening gown, and for a brief moment before we entered the ballroom, she squeezed my hand with the same quiet confidence she had shown on our wedding day. Then the evening changed. Trevor stood from his chair before dessert had even been served. He was Danielle's senior coworker, a man who never entered a room quietly because attention was the only currency he truly valued. Conversations faded as he tapped his glass with a silver spoon. Laughter rippled across the tables before he even spoke, as though everyone expected entertainment whenever Trevor found a microphone. "Before we celebrate tonight's investment," he announced, looking directly at me, "I think Danielle deserves recognition for carrying more than just her workload." A few people chuckled politely. Trevor smiled wider. "She's also been carrying her husband." The laughter grew louder. Someone near the front nearly spilled their champagne. Trevor raised one hand dramatically. "Seriously, Malcolm, what exactly do you do besides enjoy the benefits of Danielle's career?" More laughter. Heads turned toward me from every direction. Danielle forced a nervous smile, the kind people wear when they hope embarrassment will disappear if they don't acknowledge it. I could see the discomfort in her eyes, but she remained silent. Maybe she feared speaking would make things worse. Maybe she believed the moment would pass on its own. Trevor wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, "this dinner represents over $10 million in opportunity. It's probably the most expensive meal Malcolm has ever attended." Even the people who had looked uncomfortable seconds earlier began smiling, relieved that someone else had become the evening's entertainment instead of them. I looked around the ballroom slowly. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors. Investors whispered behind folded hands. Executives exchanged amused glances. Nobody knew me. Nobody asked a single question before deciding exactly who I was. I could have answered Trevor. I could have defended myself. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, took one calm sip, and set it gently back onto the table without making a sound. Trevor mistook my silence for surrender. The room mistook it for shame. Neither of them realized I wasn't waiting for courage. I was waiting for someone else to walk through the doors. I did not lower my eyes because I was embarrassed. I lowered them because I had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room usually knew the least about the people around them. Trevor believed he had me figured out after seeing me a handful of times in the office lobby, always arriving in the same pickup truck, always wearing simple clothes, always waiting for Danielle after work instead of rushing off to some important meeting. That image was enough for him to build an entire story inside his head. To him, I was the husband who lived comfortably through his wife's career. The funny thing about assumptions is that they rarely ask permission before becoming facts in someone else's mind. Danielle and I had been married for 12 years. We met before either of us had enough money to worry about appearances. Back then, our favorite Friday night was splitting a cheeseburger at a neighborhood diner because neither of us wanted to spend extra money on 2 meals. She dreamed about climbing the corporate ladder. I dreamed about building things that would last longer than quarterly reports. Life carried us in different directions, but never away from each other. At least that was what I believed. As Danielle's responsibilities grew, so did the number of evenings she spent at networking events, client dinners, and executive meetings. I encouraged every one of them. I learned how to cook meals she could reheat after coming home late. I handled grocery shopping. I kept our home running quietly behind the scenes. When friends joked that I looked more like a house manager than a husband, I simply smiled. Success looks different depending on which side of the window you are standing. Trevor entered Danielle's department about 2 years earlier. He was polished, ambitious, and always dressed as though cameras might appear at any moment. His handshake lasted half a second longer than necessary. His compliments always sounded rehearsed. The first time we met, he looked me up and down before asking what I did for a living. I answered honestly that I worked on long-term projects. He laughed politely and changed the subject before asking another question. After that, every conversation followed the same pattern. He spoke. I listened. He assumed. I never corrected him. Danielle occasionally apologized on the drive home after company gatherings. She would tell me Trevor meant well or that he had an unusual sense of humor. I believed she wanted peace more than confrontation, and I respected that. Not every misunderstanding deserves an argument. Sometimes time introduces people better than words ever can. Looking around the ballroom that evening, I realized Trevor was not the only person who had judged me. Several executives nodded along with his jokes because they recognized the stereotype. A quiet husband. A successful wife. A modest suit. An unfamiliar face. They connected those details into a story that made perfect sense to them. Nobody noticed the elderly waiter who paused for half a second after recognizing me before continuing his service with a respectful nod. Nobody questioned why one member of the hotel security team discreetly acknowledged me as he passed our table. Those moments slipped by unnoticed because everyone was focused on Trevor's performance. They were watching the man holding the microphone, while I was waiting for someone who never needed one. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, footsteps echoed across polished marble floors, steady and unhurried. And for reasons none of the guests could possibly understand, the atmosphere in the room began to shift before a single new face had even appeared. The ballroom remained suspended between laughter and curiosity as the echo of those approaching footsteps drifted closer across the marble floor. Most guests ignored the sound because they were still enjoying Trevor's performance. He basked in the applause that followed his jokes, raising his glass again as though he had just delivered the keynote speech instead of insulting someone he had never truly taken the time to know. I stayed exactly where I was, my hands resting loosely beside my untouched dinner plate. The filet mignon had gone cold several minutes earlier, but I had never come for the food. Danielle shifted uneasily beside me. She leaned closer and whispered that she was sorry about Trevor. I smiled softly and told her there was nothing to apologize for. She searched my face, perhaps expecting anger or disappointment, but found neither. Years had taught me that people reveal far more about themselves than they ever reveal about you. Across the room, one of the hotel managers suddenly adjusted his tie and hurried toward the entrance. His expression changed from routine professionalism to careful attention. A pair of security personnel quietly stepped aside as though preparing for someone important to arrive. Nobody at Trevor's table noticed because he had already started another story, entertaining several executives with exaggerated tales about closing multimillion-dollar deals. Every sentence sounded larger than the last, and every laugh fed his confidence. Then another detail slipped quietly into the room. A young assistant wearing an elegant navy suit entered through a side door, carrying a leather portfolio. She paused for only a second, scanning the ballroom before her eyes settled on me. Recognition crossed her face almost instantly. She did not wave. She did not speak. She simply offered the smallest respectful nod before continuing toward the entrance, where she waited patiently. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds, yet it caught the attention of one elderly waiter serving coffee nearby. His eyes moved from the assistant to me, and his posture straightened instinctively. I noticed Trevor watching neither of them. He remained convinced that he controlled every conversation inside the ballroom. Danielle followed my gaze toward the entrance. "Do you know someone here?" she asked quietly. I answered with complete honesty. "A few people." Before she could ask another question, Trevor raised his voice again. "Malcolm, you have been awfully quiet tonight. Surely a man married to one of our brightest employees has some career advice for the rest of us." Several guests laughed again, although this time the laughter sounded weaker. Something in the room had shifted, even if nobody could explain why. A woman seated near the center table glanced toward the entrance instead of at Trevor. Another executive checked his watch before looking toward the same doors. Anticipation had quietly replaced amusement. I noticed one familiar painting hanging above the grand staircase, a commissioned piece I had admired years earlier during private planning meetings inside this very hotel. It had not been displayed there by accident. Very few people knew its story, and even fewer knew why I remembered it so clearly. Trevor continued speaking, unaware that his audience was slowly becoming distracted. He mistook their wandering attention for admiration rather than curiosity. The heavy ballroom doors finally opened without fanfare. Conversations dissolved one by one until only the soft notes of the string quartet remained. Every head turned toward the entrance. Trevor turned last, still wearing the confident smile of a man who believed the evening belonged to him. Mine never changed because I had been expecting this moment from the very beginning. The man who stepped through the ballroom doors did not announce himself. He did not need to. The conversations that had survived Trevor's jokes faded into complete silence as guests instinctively turned toward the entrance. Victor Harrington walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. His tailored charcoal suit carried no flashy logo, no oversized watch flashed beneath the lights, no unnecessary display of wealth. The respect he commanded had never depended on appearances. Executives who had spent months hoping for 5 minutes of his attention immediately stood from their chairs. A few investors straightened their jackets. Others rehearsed welcoming smiles that appeared a little too quickly to be genuine. Trevor's expression changed almost instantly. His confidence remained, but now it was mixed with excitement. He smoothed his tie, picked up his wine glass, and stepped away from our table, clearly convinced this was his opportunity to impress one of the most influential business leaders in the room. Danielle quietly exhaled beside me. She knew Victor only by reputation, just as nearly everyone else did. His company had transformed entire industries, and earning a meeting with him often took months. Trevor hurried toward the aisle with the enthusiasm of a man convinced destiny had finally arrived. Before anyone else could move, he extended his hand and greeted Victor with an energetic smile. "Mr. Harrington, it is an honor to finally meet you. Trevor Collins, Senior Director at Meridian Strategic Partners." Victor acknowledged him with a polite nod, but his stride never slowed. The offered handshake remained suspended in the air for an awkward second before Trevor quietly withdrew it. A few nearby guests exchanged puzzled glances. Victor continued forward without saying another word. Trevor forced an uncomfortable laugh, pretending nothing unusual had happened, then quickly fell into step. Beside him, "Allow me to introduce you to everyone at the head table," he offered eagerly. Victor remained focused straight ahead. The assistant carrying the leather portfolio followed several steps behind, while hotel staff respectfully moved aside to clear the path. Every pair of eyes tracked his movement through the ballroom. Danielle leaned toward me once more. "Do you think he is heading to the investors?" she whispered. I simply smiled without answering. Trevor refused to surrender the moment. Walking beside Victor, he continued speaking about company growth, market expansion, and future partnerships, carefully choosing words designed to sound impressive. None of them earned a response. Victor's attention never shifted toward him. Instead, he continued advancing until only one table remained between us. The atmosphere became almost impossible to describe. Even the musicians slowed their performance as though sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. I noticed several guests quietly studying my face for the first time that evening, perhaps because they had begun noticing where Victor was actually walking. Trevor finally realized it as well. His smile weakened almost imperceptibly. He glanced from Victor to me and back again, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. My chair remained exactly where it had been since dinner began. I did not stand. I did not wave. I simply watched as the distance between us disappeared one measured step at a time. By the time Victor reached our table, the entire ballroom had fallen so silent that the gentle clink of a single coffee cup echoed across the room, and every person present waited for the first words that would finally explain why the most important man at the dinner had ignored everyone else to come directly to me. Victor Harrington stopped beside my chair and looked at me with the relaxed smile of an old friend who had finally reached the person he had been searching for. He did not acknowledge the dozens of executives waiting only a few feet away. He did not glance toward Trevor, whose confident posture had slowly dissolved into visible uncertainty. Instead, Victor extended his hand toward me and said, "Malcolm, I hope I did not keep you waiting too long." The silence that followed felt heavier than every conversation that had filled the ballroom only moments before. I stood and shook his hand. "You arrived exactly when I expected," I replied. Victor laughed quietly, the kind of genuine laugh that could never be rehearsed. "That is good to hear. Traffic gave me fewer favors than usual tonight." Around us, guests exchanged confused looks. Several people frowned, as though trying to remember where they might have heard my name before. Danielle looked from Victor to me with wide eyes, searching for an explanation that I had never thought necessary to give. Trevor remained frozen only a few steps away, still holding the wine glass he had nearly forgotten was in his hand. His assistant approached and carefully offered Victor the leather portfolio. Victor accepted it without opening it. Instead, he looked at me once more. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Whenever you are." Nothing else. No explanation. No dramatic announcement. Just 6 simple words exchanged between two people who clearly understood something nobody else in the ballroom could yet see. The mystery only deepened. Whispered conversations immediately spread from one table to another. One investor quietly asked another whether I worked for Victor's company. Someone else guessed I might be an attorney. Another insisted I had to be a consultant hired for the investment negotiations. Every theory sounded confident until another person suggested something completely different. Trevor finally forced himself to speak. "Mr. Harrington," he interrupted with a polite smile that no longer looked natural, "I did not realize Malcolm was part of your organization." Victor turned toward him for the first time that evening. His expression remained courteous, but there was a noticeable pause before he answered. "Organization?" he repeated thoughtfully. "No, Malcolm has never worked for me." Trevor relaxed just enough to believe the answer supported every assumption he had made. A faint smile returned to his face. Before he could speak again, Victor continued, "If anything, I have spent years hoping I would have the opportunity to work with him." The smile disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Several executives exchanged startled glances. Danielle slowly turned toward me, confusion giving way to disbelief. I could almost hear every unanswered question forming inside her mind. Victor still had not explained who I was, only what I was not. That single sentence transformed the atmosphere inside the ballroom more effectively than any dramatic speech ever could. Suddenly, nobody seemed interested in dessert or investment projections. Every eye remained fixed on our table. The assumptions that had filled the room all evening were beginning to collapse under their own weight. Trevor opened his mouth as though searching for another joke, but none came. For the first time since dinner had begun, he looked like a man who understood that confidence built on incomplete information could disappear in a matter of seconds. Victor rested the unopened portfolio gently on the table beside my untouched plate and smiled again. "There is one more signature we need before tonight can truly begin," he said, and the entire ballroom leaned forward without realizing they had all stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. Victor slid the leather portfolio toward me with the same calm confidence he had carried from the moment he entered the ballroom. Every eye followed the movement as though the folder itself contained the answer to a question nobody had thought to ask until now. I opened it without rushing. The pages inside were familiar because I had reviewed them 3 nights earlier. Only one signature remained before the agreement could become official. Victor rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair and looked at me with quiet respect. "Everything is exactly as we discussed," he said. "Nothing changed unless you wanted it to." I nodded as I turned the final page. "Good. Then there is no reason to delay." The room remained silent except for the faint sound of paper moving beneath my fingertips. Trevor finally cleared his throat. "I apologize," he said carefully, forcing a polite smile back onto his face. "I think everyone here is a little confused." Victor glanced toward him again, although his attention returned to me almost immediately. "Confusion usually disappears once people have all the facts," he answered evenly. Danielle looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not fear. It was not embarrassment. It was the look of someone realizing there was an entire chapter of a story she had never known existed. "Malcolm," she asked quietly, "what is happening?" I looked at her gently before answering. "Nothing unexpected. I simply never believed every part of my work needed to come home with me. She searched my face as though replaying years of conversations in her mind, trying to connect memories that suddenly carried different meanings. The evenings when I had quietly taken business calls from my office after dinner. The weekends when I occasionally flew out for a single day and returned before sunrise. The conferences I had described only as meetings. None of those moments had been lies. They had simply never required long explanations. Victor smiled. One of the things I have always admired about Malcolm is that he has never introduced himself by his accomplishments. That is becoming a rare quality. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had spent the evening introducing themselves through job titles, company valuations, and investment portfolios. Trevor looked as though he wanted to interrupt again, but could not find the right words. The confidence that had fueled every joke earlier in the evening had quietly disappeared. Victor turned another page inside the portfolio and gently rotated it so the signature line faced me. "Whenever you are ready," he said. I uncapped the fountain pen resting beside the documents. Before placing the tip on the paper, I paused for a moment and looked across the ballroom. Hundreds of faces stared back at me. Some looked confused. Others looked anxious. A few already seemed embarrassed by their earlier laughter. Nobody smiled anymore. They were no longer trying to determine whether I belonged in the room. They were trying to understand why the room itself suddenly seemed to revolve around someone they had dismissed less than. 15 minutes earlier, I signed my name with one smooth motion and returned the pen to the table. Victor closed the portfolio carefully, extended his hand once more, and said in a voice that carried effortlessly through the silent ballroom, "Congratulations, Malcolm. It has been an honor partnering with the founder whose vision made this entire $10 million investment possible." Victor's words settled over the ballroom with astonishing weight. Nobody reacted immediately because the human mind sometimes refuses to accept information that completely overturns everything it believed only moments before. Founder. The word echoed silently across hundreds of expressions. Trevor stared at me as though he expected Victor to laugh and admit it had all been an elaborate misunderstanding. That moment never came. Instead, Victor calmly turned toward the audience and spoke with the same measured confidence that had made people trust him with billions of dollars in business decisions. "Many of you know the platform that made tonight's investment possible," he said. "Very few of you know the man who created the original architecture behind it." Malcolm never wanted publicity. He never asked to have his photograph on magazine covers. He cared more about solving problems than collecting applause. A quiet murmur spread from table to table. Several executives immediately reached for their phones beneath the tablecloths. Within seconds, they found exactly what they were searching for. Old interviews without photographs. Industry articles mentioning an unusually private founder. Archived conference transcripts where my name appeared only once before disappearing from public attention. One by one, disbelief turned into recognition. Danielle looked at me as if she had suddenly met a stranger who somehow still carried the same gentle smile she had known for more than a decade. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked softly. I met her eyes without anger or accusation. "Because I wanted you to love the life we built together, not the headlines attached to my name. Every achievement eventually becomes yesterday's news. Character stays much longer." She lowered her eyes, not from shame alone, but from the realization that she had spent years defending me against assumptions without ever realizing how incomplete her own understanding had been. Trevor finally found his voice. "If this is true," he said cautiously, "then why would you let everyone believe you were ordinary?" I almost smiled at the question. "Because I am ordinary," I answered. "I buy groceries. I wait in traffic. I make breakfast on Saturday mornings. I forget to water the plants sometimes. Money changes your options. It does not change your humanity unless you allow it to." No one laughed this time. Victor folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "That answer," he said, "is exactly why Malcolm earned my respect long before we ever became business partners." He turned toward the guests once more. "Most people spend their careers trying to convince the world they are important. Malcolm spent his protecting the freedom to live without proving anything to anyone." The silence became almost reflective. Faces that had been filled with amusement earlier now carried something entirely different. Some showed embarrassment. Others showed admiration. A few revealed regret. I noticed the elderly waiter from earlier standing quietly near the service station. When our eyes met again, he offered another respectful nod, this time without hesitation. I returned the gesture with a smile. Respect given freely had always meant more to me than admiration earned through wealth. Trevor slowly lowered his wine glass onto the nearest table. His shoulders relaxed, not because he felt comfortable, but because pretending no longer seemed possible. For the first time that evening, he looked at me instead of looking past me. In that single moment, the room stopped measuring people by tailored suits, expensive watches, and impressive titles. They finally began measuring them by something that had been sitting quietly among them all along. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but it no longer sounded like the same room. The laughter that had echoed so confidently earlier in the evening had disappeared, replaced by quiet conversations spoken in careful voices. People who had eagerly joined. Trevor's jokes now avoided looking in my direction for more than a second at a time. It was remarkable how quickly certainty could vanish once the truth entered the room. Victor thanked several investors for their patience before stepping away to speak with members of his legal team. He never once tried to celebrate what had just happened. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that dignity did not need an audience. Danielle remained beside me, still searching for words that refused to come. Finally, she spoke so quietly that only I could hear her. I feel like I have been seeing only part of you all these years. I looked at her with the same calm expression I had carried throughout the evening. You have seen the part that mattered most, I answered. The rest was only business. She shook her head gently. No, I accepted everyone else's assumptions without realizing it. I defended you, but I never really questioned why you never cared what people thought. I smiled softly, because I learned a long time ago that opinions arrive much faster than understanding. Before she could respond, Trevor slowly approached our table. Gone was the polished confidence that had defined him all evening. He no longer carried himself like the loudest man in the room. He looked like someone replaying every sentence he wished he could take back. He stopped a respectful distance away. Malcolm, he began, taking a slow breath. I owe you an apology. I judged you without knowing anything about you. What I said earlier was disrespectful, and I am genuinely sorry. Several nearby guests quietly stopped their conversations. They were listening again, but for a very different reason. I stood and faced Trevor without raising my voice. I appreciate you saying that. Relief briefly crossed his face, but I continued before he could speak again. However, this evening was never really about me. He looked confused. I glanced around the ballroom. Think about how easily everyone accepted your version of who I was. Nobody asked a question. Nobody wondered if there might be another story. They simply decided that the way someone looked, dressed, or behaved was enough to measure their worth. Trevor lowered his eyes. There was no argument left to make. Respect cannot depend on a job title, I said. If someone deserves kindness only after you discover they are successful, then it was never respect to begin with. It was convenience. Those words settled over the nearby tables with far more force than any public confrontation could have achieved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody objected. Even the executives who had spent years negotiating billion-dollar agreements seemed to understand that they had witnessed a lesson no balance sheet could teach. Danielle reached for my hand beneath the table, and this time I felt something different in the gesture. It was not uncertainty. It was gratitude mixed with humility. Across the ballroom, the elderly waiter smiled quietly before returning to his work, serving every guest with exactly the same care he had shown from the beginning of the evening. Watching him, I realized he had understood the true measure of people long before anyone else in that room had finally begun to learn it. The evening continued, but it no longer belonged to the investment presentation. It belonged to a lesson that no speaker had planned and no agenda had listed. Conversations resumed cautiously as guests returned to their seats, although the atmosphere had changed beyond recognition. People who had introduced themselves through titles now introduced themselves through handshakes. Executives who had walked past the hotel staff without a glance suddenly offered polite smiles and sincere thanks. Nothing about the ballroom had changed, yet everything inside it felt different. Victor excused himself to complete several final discussions with the investors. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "I knew you would handle tonight exactly this way." I smiled. There was never another way. He nodded once before disappearing into another conversation. Danielle and I stood together near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Thousands of lights stretched across the city like stars resting on the ground. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence carries more honesty than explanations ever can. Finally, Danielle looked at me with tears resting gently in her eyes, not from sadness, but from understanding. I spent years believing I knew everything about the man I married, she said softly. Tonight, I realized I only knew the parts you thought were important for our family. I took her hand. Those were the important parts. The business was simply work. You were always my real success. She smiled through a quiet breath, and for the first time that evening the weight she had carried seemed to disappear. As the dinner came to an end, guests began making their way toward the exit. Many stopped to shake my hand. Some apologized. Others simply thanked me for reminding them of something they admitted they had forgotten during their pursuit of success. Trevor approached one final time. This time there was no audience around him, no microphone, and no desire to impress anyone. I hope one day I earn the kind of confidence you showed tonight, he said honestly. I answered with the only advice I believed mattered. Confidence does not come from knowing your value. It comes from not needing strangers to confirm it. He nodded slowly before walking away, carrying those words with him. The elderly waiter passed our table once more while collecting the final coffee cups. Before leaving, I thanked him for taking such good care of everyone throughout the evening. His smile widened. Sir, he replied warmly, I have learned that every guest deserves the same respect before I know their story. I shook his hand because he had understood the lesson long before the rest of us. Danielle and I stepped outside together into the cool night air. The sounds of the city replaced the quiet elegance of the ballroom. Valets hurried between arriving cars. Taxi lights reflected across the pavement. Our old pickup truck waited exactly where we had left it. I opened the passenger door for Danielle, and she laughed gently. You could drive anything in the world, she said. I closed the door after she climbed inside. Maybe, I answered as I walked around to the driver's seat. But this truck has carried us through every chapter that mattered. As we pulled away from the hotel, the glowing skyline slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. I did not leave feeling richer than when I arrived because money had never been the victory. I left grateful that truth had spoken more quietly than pride ever could. The most valuable thing I carried home that night was not a signed agreement or a successful investment. It was the reminder that genuine character never needs an introduction, real dignity never competes for attention, and the strongest people in any room are usually the ones who never feel the need to prove they belong there.